Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first in our webinar series on climate action and climate finance. My name is Rosie Helson, and I'm Marketing Manager at Natural Capital Partners. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us today. This, in the first of our series, is entitled The Calculus of Climate Change in a Viral World. Is it time to recalibrate? And I'm just going to run through a few logistics. So this webinar is a short one, like all in this series, just 30 minutes, and we'll leave a few minutes at the end for audience questions. So you can ask questions during the presentation. On the panel in the right-hand side, you're all muted in listen-only mode, and we'll go through your questions at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our main speaker for today, Jonathan Shopley, who is Natural Capital Partners Managing Director of External Affairs. Over to you, Jonathan.
Rosie, thanks. I'd really like to add my warm welcome and appreciation for you. Normally, I say at this stage, taking half an hour out of your busy day to join this webinar, but I guess it's even busier, as I suspect the majority of you will be locked down with kids, pets, a day job and a home job all converging. So particularly appreciate your attendance this afternoon. Before I kick off on the subject, calculus of climate change in a viral world, what I'd like to do is just take the pulse across all of you tuned in with a quick poll. So it's really, what do you see view as the greatest barrier to corporate action on climate change? And there are 4 options for you to vote on. Slowing momentum on the Paris Agreement with a delay to COP26. Of course, we know that that's been pushed into the next year. Anticipating or responding to unexpected and exponential changes, just like the COVID-19 situation and crisis that we're in at the moment. Coordination of sustainability's efforts within and across nations. What we've seen with the coronavirus is that every nation seems to have taken its own path. Climate success depends on us working across all nations. And then the final one, a lack of effective climate leadership within the private sector. Not to say that there isn't great climate leadership in the private sector, but are we being effective in getting all of the sector aligned with our climate goals? Please vote now. Give you a couple of seconds just to cast your vote, and then we'll show the results of that and move on. Okay, so let's see. Slowing momentum and anticipating exponential changes are level tie, but the coordination of sustainability's efforts within and across nations, which I think links back to COP26 and the fact that we sort of have the Paris Agreement, but it's sort of missing in action at the moment, as we don't have certain parts of that, Article 6 in particular, sort of nailed down. And the lack of effective climate leadership, I guess we're agreed there is good climate leadership, but I'm going to come back to that issue in a later part of this presentation. Could I have the next slide? So a random photo, but let me explain. Those of you who've attended webinars in the past probably know that I tend to have rugby as a bit of a theme. This is a picture of one of the 7 events we held as part of our Talanoa dialogue, kicked off by the Fijians when they were presiding over the climate negotiations a couple of years back. And the invitation went out to all parties with an interest in the Paris Agreement to use the Talanoa dialogues as an opportunity to focus on issues and bring their thoughts and enthusiasm and innovations to the UNFCCC. We did this on net zero. We used the rugby ball as a sort of a focus for that conversation, noting that the Fijians had won a major international tournament at the Olympics in rugby. A nation of 800,000 people took on the world and won. So we thought that that was a great emblem or symbol totem to sort of have at each of the individual dialogues. Now, and this, by the way, I just wanted to point out, this was our event hosted by ING in the Netherlands, and clearly has the youngest participant of all. That's Elodie, daughter of Ashley Myers, with IKEA. Sort of gave us a real opportunity to think into the next generation. But before I leave that, and just to give a little bit of context to my sort of focus on rugby, I'd like to share a little personal story before I get down into the substance of the webinar. I grew up in South Africa. I was schooled in Cape Town at Rondebosch School. At the time that I went to Rondebosch, I thought that sport and rugby in particular was fun and maths was a grind, until my then maths teacher, a guy called Tiki Diaga, and this is back in the 70s, I should warn you, turned out to be our rugby coach. And by the way, I wasn't a particularly good rugby player. I really enjoyed getting wet and muddy for the most part. But Tiki Diaga combined maths and rugby in a very unique way. And when we were introduced to trigonometry, he used the conversion or penalty kick as an example of how kickers tend to measure the tangent when they're about to kick a ball. And if you've watched rugby, you'll see it with any kicker. They kind of eye up the length to the posts and then the height of the crossbar, step back, take aim, and generally it goes over. And of course, South Africa won the last Rugby World Cup, so they're obviously very good at that. So when we were in the classroom and off the rugby field, we kept on saying, well, you know, all this trigonometry is all good and well, but really in a game of rugby, there's so many other things. There's wind, slippery balls if it's raining, wonky kicks, whatever. And we sort of challenged Tiki Diaga on that. And he said, well, you know, at that point, you've got to recognize that calculus, human experience, and intelligence take over. And no good kicker ever aims at the bar. They always aim well above it and into the wind to make sure that they've taken all unexpected variables into account, or as many as they can. Anyway, we moved on from trigonometry into calculus, and that's when things really got interesting, and I did find myself giving as much attention to the maths as I did to rugby. We have, next slide if you would, we have, you've all seen this graph. It's global greenhouse emissions, where we might be today, and I'm not bothered to calibrate this. We all know kind of where we are. We're not at a peak point yet. We probably will need a very rapid exponential reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And then more importantly, when we get to the inflection point of net zero, we will probably have to go beyond that and remove or lower the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So what Tiki Diaga then went on to teach us about calculus is that there are two forms of it. Of course, there's the differentials, which is the rate of change of any of these curves. And you know, he was very good at getting us to imagine things. Imagine what it feels like to sort of walk up a gently rising slope and then to slip down an exponential curve. What does it feel like? The rates of acceleration that you might feel, the rates of change, which is what differentials in calculus is all about. And then also think about what happens when you get to an inflection point. How do you know when you've reached one? How do you know when you've reached the peak? How do you change your behavior as you travel up that curve? And then the second thing that he explained around the integrals of calculus is, as you change, you're laying down, and this is the blue zone in this graph, you're laying down an accumulated or aggregated consequences. Of course, we know that. So ultimately, what we need to do is not, as Tiki Diaga advised, is aim at the bar of net zero. We really need to aim beyond that or above that and lean into the wind or any headwinds we might face, and think about removals as well as a mechanism to repair the atmosphere. Now, I think that's probably all I'll say around that graph, and by way of linking into my rugby experience and then and connecting that with climate. But one of the things that the lens of calculus allows us to do is to sort of examine a range of things that where we've learned, where we used human intelligence and experience to make better decisions or to fix the things that have gone wrong. So, for example, two calculus kind of examples from climate change. When the EU designed and implemented the emission trading scheme, there was a general belief that economic growth would lead to growth in emissions, and that we'd have a rising curve for as long as we could see it. Of course, the 2007 and 8 financial crisis blew a hole right through that assumption, and that whole mechanism for controlling climate change sort of collapsed as a result of that. We hadn't really taken into account that change can be both positive and negative, and can change, and it can change from one to the other very quickly, as it did. The other example that I'd like to mention is that in the early days of our sort of engagement with climate, there was a concept of peak oil, which was put out there by those of us in the environmental and sustainability community, which said, we really need to warn the shareholders of oil, gas, fossil fuel companies that the price of oil will increase over time as fossil fuel reserves run out, and renewables will become cheaper, and therefore oil companies will actually go out of business as a result of decreasing demand. Now, of course, it took Carbon Tracker, the research organization, to sort of find the folly in that, and what they did is they didn't look at the rate of change, they looked at the accumulated greenhouse gases that are building up in the atmosphere, and said, look, we're not going to reach peak oil. What's going to happen is we're going to run out of the capacity to absorb any more greenhouse gas emissions, particularly from the use of fossil fuels. And in fact, today I would say that most of the fossil fuel companies are responding to the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and not the highly volatile price of oil. So how do we calibrate where we are on the curve? And again, if I could just mention that I go back to my South African story. I left South Africa in 1982, sorry, because I was looking at a country that looked like there was no way in which the apartheid regime would be replaced by a democracy, a fair democracy. And I just couldn't see any rates of change that would get us there. Fast forward 8 years, and Mandela walked free from jail, and 4 years later, he was one of the most charismatic and admired leaders of South Africa. Fast forward again to where we are today, 25 years later, and South Africa, sadly, has just had its sovereign debt rated as junk. So very difficult to anticipate rates of change, but this is the world that we live in. Next slide, please. So when I arrived in the UK, I was very fortunate to meet up with John Elkington. Those of you in the sustainability community will probably know him as the author of The Green Capitalists and the father of the triple bottom line concept. And he and I co-authored a report for WRI in 1985 looking at the tech industry's contribution to sustainable development. And I went off and visited a couple of these supercomputers that really dominated the scene at the time. And the top left-hand image is a Cray computer, which was the most powerful computer at the time. And back in 1985, we weren't even thinking or talking about smartphones. And fast forward from 85 to where we are now, and what we find is smartphones have absolutely gone viral in a very positive way. And Moore's law, the halving of the price of computing power, while the price of computing, while the capacity of computing has increased year on year to give us a vastly transformed society. Now, on the bottom half of this diagram, what we see on the left is a standing forest, which really represents the accumulated impact of sequestration over decades, centuries. And one of the things that we are obviously focused on in our work in climate is to find the engineered solutions, the top two images that get us on that curve of change, that gets us to solutions that are cheaper and more effective over time, stabilizing the atmospheric carbon. We also try to combine that with projects or approaches that protect the accumulated positive impact that we've set out over the years. And of course, we'd like to improve that. We don't just want to protect what we've accumulated, we want to plant more trees, but it takes a long time for a tree to evolve into a self-regulating, sustaining ecosystem, as you see on the left of this of the bottom in the bottom image. So the second thing that the second point I wanted to make about calculus is that you really need an abundance of solutions to prepare yourself for rapid and uncharted change, so that we can have an abundance of solutions that work to both address the accumulated benefits and also the rates of change. Next slide, please. Going back to John Elkington, so that was some time ago that he and I worked together, but today, as it happens, he's released a book called, which is entitled Green Swans, and it focuses on regenerative capitalism. One of the images or diagrams in the book is this one. And I think it's really helpful in sort of figuring out where we are now, both in terms of rates of change and scale. So you can see that the vertical axis is really how powerful the change is. And we are, I would argue, stuck on an incremental curve. No more than 1 times what we're doing, which is the sort of the middle axis there. What we really want is to find things that are exponentially good. And John's term for that is green swans rather than black swans. What we don't, and then along the horizontal axis is how many people are affected, because people are very much part of the change that we either wrought or want to bring to bear. And obviously there are billions and millions to the left of that diagram, and millions and billions to the right, but negatively on the left and positively on the right. So clearly we're in business as usual. We might get to change as usual. Things are changing all the time, but really what we want to do is to get to the top right box, where we have exponential change that positively impacts millions, if not billions of people. So really the goal here, the breakthrough that we've mentioned, is really the breakthrough when we breach net zero, so that it becomes not really the target, not the target, but the inflection point at which the scary risk we face from climate is replaced by an abundance of opportunities, whether it's protecting forests, planting new forests, or engineered solutions that we've yet to bring to bear. So that is what I wanted to say in terms of, by way of summarizing the calculus of climate change. I think what I'd like to do now is take some questions from you before we do a final poll.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Jonathan. And I love the analogy and comparison between rugby and calculus. So we've had a couple of questions come in. I'll see how many we can get through in the time, as this is a fairly short webinar. So the first one is related to the virus. So what have we learned from the COVID-19 crisis that we can apply directly now to our response to climate?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for raising that, because I've tried hard not to focus too much on the black swan of the coronavirus, and more on the green swan in terms of what we've been trying to achieve in sort of getting ahead of the curve on climate change. But I think if we look into the corona situation, the answer to that question is we really need speed. We need to figure out how to bring solutions that have an equal but opposite sort of exponential impact, that are scalable in that regard. I think the point that I've made through the webinar is we need an abundance of solutions. We are seeing it right now. We're trying to get vaccines sorted out. We're trying to get tests sorted out. We're trying to figure out whether physical distancing and face masks are the right thing to do. We also need, and I think that those of you who read Yuval Harari will have picked this up in a recent article, we need to think globally. This is a global issue, and climate's a global issue. And I think, if anything, we've learned from the COVID example that we tended to retreat both into our homes and into our countries, and we really need international coordination. Not to say that that's been absent from the corona situation, but it certainly would have been helped with a lot more collaboration across the world.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. And talking about thinking globally, thinking now about the prioritization, and this question is about, do you have advice for companies deciding between reducing or avoiding emissions versus removing emissions, and how should companies prioritize in that way?
That's a great question, because I think if my presentation around the calculus of climate change is, you know, if the arguments I've made are supportable, then we need everything. We need to slow down the rate of emission into the atmosphere. We need to figure out how to get removals. We need an abundance of solutions right now. So how does a company choose between one or the other? And I think what we've found is that companies will care about certain things, certain kinds of interventions, which play very directly onto their core business strategies. And I think that's the best way for companies to figure out which kind of solutions they want to back. So a great example might be Taylor's Tea here in the UK has chosen reforestation in their tea supply chains because it creates benefits for those kinds of projects, create benefits for local communities and for the tea growing activities itself. A very different example would be Microsoft, deeply committed to their AI capabilities, artificial intelligence and data management, big data management capabilities, to solving environmental problems through their AI for Earth platform. Now, they would probably be very keen on matching out, you know, focusing on those solutions that need that kind of tech power behind it to do big data analysis to figure out how well and how effective and how we can improve on these solutions. So 2 examples there.
That's lovely, and those are really great, inspiring company programs from Microsoft and Taylor's. We've had another question come in from Eric, which is also about inspiration. So Natural Capital Partners has been active seeking this breakthrough, which Jonathan showed in his slide, alluded to in Green Swans. What trends do you see today that are particularly inspiring?
Wow, there are a lot of trends that are inspiring. But you know, given what I've said, it's anything that sort of seeks to bring new solutions to bear. So, you know, we've always been a little wary of engineered solutions. We equate that or conflate that with geoengineering, mirrors in space. But I think there's an enormous amount of work going on to figure out how we capture greenhouse gases from the air and turn them into non-global warming gases or solids. You know, the price of that is probably about $120, $100 a ton compared to the natural climate solutions that are already well established. But if you follow the Moore's curve, the example of the Cray computer to the smartphone, we should be able to bring those engineered solutions down in price significantly and up in power. So I'm very intrigued by that. But at the same account, I really am much encouraged by the way in which we are focusing on all of the accumulated solutions that we've managed over the years, the standing forests, the sequestration in highly biodiverse ecosystems, and the way in which we are developing new ways of protecting those forests at scale.
Great, thank you. We've got time for a couple more questions, I think, so do keep them coming in. We've had one come in on carbon neutrality. So what role does carbon neutrality have to play in a world where we need to move towards removals rapidly?
Yeah, I think that whole issue, this may be where abundance becomes a little bit difficult. We've got many ways in which corporates are trying to figure out how to align their individual actions with the Paris Agreement or the science. You know, so we have terms that are being used: carbon neutrality, net zero, carbon positive. So for me, I think the role of carbon neutrality specifically is a really highly communicable hook that corporates can hang their hat on. That's all about immediate action, financing, emission reductions and removals wherever they may be most needed or most effective, cost effective around the world. And then there are other concepts around net zero, which are sort of more focused on transitions or transformations of business models to net zero. And, you know, at the beginning, I mentioned climate, or I mentioned leadership or climate leadership in the poll that we had. And I think we've got great climate leaders who are really showing the way, getting in, taking on carbon neutral, taking on science-based targets, aiming at carbon positive. But what I think we need, if we're going to get an abundance of solutions, if we're going to get a bottom-up exponential change in behavior and business models across the private sector, then we need to give every company an on-ramp, a mechanism which allows them to immediately engage in the issue, respond to the emergency, and then adapt their business models over time to the net zeros and the carbon positives, which are fantastic. So for me, it's as much about the smart followers having concepts that they can use today to make progress today and to begin that deeper transformation represented or held out by the climate leaders.
That's a lovely illustration. And speaking of immediate action, I'm going to try and squeeze one last question in because I also want to hear the answer to this one. So right now, obviously, business as usual has stopped for most or for many people. Any thoughts on how we maintain some of those changes in the future to help deal with climate change? For example, fewer flights.
Gee, I think that's a tough one, but I would say, you know, one of the points perhaps that I didn't make about the calculus, you know, the aggregated changes under a curve, the longer this goes on, the more difficult it's going to be to go back to business as normal, or the new normal will be defined by the way in which we change our perceptions as to whether it's more effective to work in an office or to work at home. Whether the daily commute that we subject billions of people to every day are worthwhile giving up for a more flexible working arrangements, whether the video conferencing facilities really represent a more, you know, an opportunity to reduce travel at, you know, significantly. I don't know what we can, how we can bake those in, but my sense is that the change that we've been subjected to, and I think John Elkington's book, the Green Swan book, really talks about the sort of interventions that force us to rethink and put ourselves on very different trajectories. And I've no doubt that this Black Swan event will stimulate many Green Swan opportunities in the future.
Let's hope. So we are almost at time, but we've got time to run one quick poll. So that should appear on your screens now. What would be the most valuable topics to advance dialogue around current issues? And there's 4 options there. This might actually help us run another webinar in our series for you that speaks to some topics that you would like to hear more about. So how to reach for carbon neutrality, net zero and beyond, or perhaps you'd like to hear about repairing the atmosphere with natural and engineered solutions. How to build enduring climate leadership, and Jonathan has spoken about that today. How to take action aligned with the Paris Agreement before it is finalized. So give a couple of seconds for you to respond, and then we will take a look at the answers there. Interesting. Okay, so yes, it seems like the language around carbon neutral, net zero, and different targets that companies are setting at the moment is a hot topic at the moment. But there are a lot of votes also for the other 3. So we'll take that on board, and hopefully we'll be able to do all of them. All right,
And
so
Rosie, if I might say, we've given our 4, and maybe on your next slide, I would just say how much I'd appreciate it if anybody has comments on the things we've discussed today, or further thoughts about issues we should focus down on, do deep dives around this calculus approach.
yeah, absolutely. So please go ahead and get in contact. There will be a webinar recording available on our website and sent around to you all. So thank you once again for joining, listening, asking questions, and thank you to Jonathan for speaking.
Thank you all. Stay well. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.